Hey everyone, welcome back. Today I wanted to take a look at some other ideas that help to influence the themes and the values of the Renaissance. And this is going to apply our ongoing discussion of art and also our ongoing discussion of mythology. And so some of those applications of mythology will be particularly important. And we'll be studying the ideas of Apollonian versus Dionysian ideals, and I wanted to talk a little bit more about that. This comes from the work of Friedrich Nietzsche, who is a 19th century philosopher, and he wrote The Birth of Tragedy in 1872, and this is his very first book that he wrote, but it really captures the essence of not only society, but also the arts, and it's kind of interesting, some of his ideas and the wide application of them. He argues that there are mainly impulses within each human being, and because of this, it's then reflected within each, society or culture that they're in. There's the impulse of art and science, and he calls this impulse Apollo or Apollonian impulses. Apollo, as we've talked about a little bit in our discussion on mythology, he's the god of light, the god of knowledge, the god of science and thinking, so all scientific advancements come from him, and his gifts to humanity are that of science and prophecy, right? The ability to kind of know what's going to happen. So similar to this, right, it would be like meteorology, where we use science to be able to know, right, what's coming, or to track hurricanes or whatnot. So be able to try to control in some way the natural world. His art that he's associated with is that of sculpture, right? Because sculpture's in three-dimensional. It's more, in that sense, it's more realistic in a sense. But his values are order, logic, clarity, and moderation. And so what Nietzsche argues is that these impulses are going to be embedded within each person. You might know someone who is more Apollonian, right? Someone that's very ordered, very logical, clear, moderation, always focusing on controlling his or her surroundings. And probably this type of person is going to have a label maker and put labels on everything in the apartment to mark his or her territory. But everything's going to have, set schedules of cleaning and whatnot. That would be kind of an Apollonian type person. On the other hand, right, there's another type of impulse, which would be considered Dionysian impulse. Dionysius is the god of liquid earth, that meaning from the wine, right? So this is the liquid that comes from the earth, comes from the grape, and so therefore it's wine. His gifts very different from that of Apollo. His gifts are wine and hallucinations. And so rather than science and then being able to kind of control our environment and control the natural world, his is more on escaping from it, right? And rather than prophecy, right? Prophecy is getting us to know what's going to happen and how it's going to happen. His gifts are that of hallucination, which is a totally different, right? It's more of an emotional, quasi-spiritual kind of connection. And his value is that of music, right? The music is much more emotionally driven than rationally created. The values of a Dionysian impulses are spontaneity, passion, intuition, excess, rebellion, etc. And so what he argues is that there could be other people out there, maybe you know some people who are more spontaneous and passionate, right? These are the type of people that say, hey, let's just blow off classes and go to LA for the weekend or whatever, right? Focusing more on excess or rebelling, trying to resist the rules, right? These are all impulses that would be associated with a Dionysian kind of person. And that's not to say that one person is going to be all one or all the other. He actually argues that most people are going to find a balance between them. There's going to be moments in our lives where we're going to have to focus more on order and logic, and there should be more moments where we can focus on spontaneity and passion. But generally what happens in reality is that people tend to be a little bit more one than the other. But he also applies this to civilizations, right? He says civilizations struggle between Apollonian and Dionysian impulses. And this is some of his argument. He says, as civilizations become advanced, they lose their primal impulses. As they become more advanced scientifically, they start to have structure, right? They start to become more scientific, right? And they start to lose that kind of primitive essence that kind of initially bound them together. They lose their spirituality, they grow in pride, and eventually fall, right? And so we have to wonder if that sounds familiar, right? So one of the main themes of the Book of Mormon is this pride cycle. And he suggests that this happens again and again in civilization, whether it's Rome or whether it's Greece. The same kind of patterns emerge where people are initially kind of tribal and agrarian, and they start to develop science, technology, industry, and then they become very structured and regimented, but eventually they tend to fall, right? He says that this affects art. As societies develop, they become more formulaic and less emotional. Nietzsche suggests that Greek playwrights saw this and wanted to save Greece by reintroducing emotion through their art. They wanted to caution against having too much reason. Too much reason becomes an anesthetic. It becomes a painkiller, and civilization loses its capacity to feel, because generally we don't want to feel feelings of remorse or regret or sorrow, right? We'd rather just deaden everything than to have these kind of negative feelings. But the truth of the matter is, if we're going to have happiness and joy, we're also going to have regret and sorrow, right? We learned that from the Garden of Eden. We need to be able to have both, with that wide range of feelings, right? But generally what tends to happen is the more scientific we become, the more we try to control the amount of pain or suffering in our particular lives, and that causes us to lose the capacity to feel anything, right? Then what happens is we start to lose our traditions, we start to lose our identity, and it loses its connection with God, right? Its civilization loses its connection with God. It eventually falls away and is replaced by another civilization. What he argues is that civilizations need to, and art need to find a balance between Dionysian and Apollonian impulses to be healthy, right? We can't just all be, Dionysian and chaotic and disorganized and, completely anarchic, focusing on, lawlessness and rebellion. But we also can't just be focusing on law and order and this kind of strict regiment where, if you can point to any dystopian film that covers that particular theme, that we start to lose our capacity to feel and have empathy for one another, right? And so he says that in order for art to happen, for it to be beautiful, so this is Nietzsche's discussion that adds to our discussion of art and beauty, he suggests you have to find the balance between Dionysian and Apollonian impulses to be healthy and for art to be beautiful. All right, so just taking a look at the application of some of these ideas, right? He argues that there's this idea, this tension between civilization, Apollonian impulses, and barbarism, which would be Dionysian impulses. And these components are constantly competing. They're the same, they're two halves of the same coin, right? Constantly competing, right? Civilization is trying to always beat down barbarism, and barbarism is always trying to tear down civilization. He points to a couple examples. One example that he points to is Athens versus Sparta, right? Athens advanced in architecture, science, and philosophy. Athens tried to bring the Malayans under control, and they destroyed the entire civilization in a moment of genocide. They tried to do the same thing again with Sparta, but this time they lost. And so they kept trying to advance. They kept trying to expand their influence and bring what they considered quote-unquote civilization to the lives of the others within the Mediterranean. And eventually the Spartans, who they considered to be more barbaric and less civilized than them, they actually failed with them, right? See the same thing with the Romans versus the barbarians, right? Civilization versus barbarism. Rome was also advancing government, architecture, and science. They owned most of the Mediterranean world, but they became too big and couldn't maintain order. And eventually, they were overcome by these tribes to the north, right? And so, again, we have to think about, right, how does this apply to us today? As we start to think about the United States is now kind of the Rome of the world, with a large military power, a large economic power, and we're trying to spread our influence economically and politically throughout the world. But then there's always these other forces that are seeking to tear it down, whether it's Al-Qaeda or ISIS, whatever the case may be. There's these small pockets of groups that are trying to resist the efforts to become, quote-unquote, civilized, to maintain their autonomy. But we see this in the Book of Mormon as well, right? Where the Nephites were the symbols of civilization. They're the ones that were wearing the armor, the breastplates and the helmets, and creating, organization and order. They were using strategy. And the Lamanites were generally the ones that didn't really have the armor. They kind of lived more of a barbaric type of a life. And they were competing. They were competing against one another. And there were points that the Nephites became so Apollonian, so scientifically driven, so civilized, for the lack of a better term, that they then became prideful. They lost their ability to feel, and they then fell, right? And so we see this again and again, this idea of order versus chaos. But we also see this within the arts. Within the Renaissance, we see a focus on refinement and control and being restrained. Very Apollonian principles. We've talked about this one before, where it focuses on the horizontal and the vertical lines in order to create this sense of balance and symmetry. We've talked a little bit about how the Renaissance artists were seeking to replicate the ideas of Plato by using mathematical principles as the standard of beauty. Since God's language is math, we want to mirror God's creations, because God's creations are the perfect, the eternal. And if we are to mimic, right, to create that beauty, that standard that God has given us, we need to follow mathematical principles. And so they were very refined. They focused more on this Apollonian ideals. But then we see more Dionysian in art as well, right? So there's that kind of these elements to it. And Jackson Pollock, when most people take a look at this particular work of art that don't really know about, a lot about modern art or Jackson Pollock, I would call them the uninitiated. When they take a look at this, they just see chaos on a canvas, right? Just flicks of paint that are covered. But here's kind of what Pollock says about this, right? I want you to think about this in connection to his Dionysian attempt here. Here we don't necessarily see the extreme, the restrained order that we see within Raphael's, where there's the same amount of people on one side as on the other and trying to focus on balance and harmony. We see more chaos. Here's what he says. It says, "It seems to me that the modern painter cannot express this age, the airplane, the atomic bomb, the radio, in the old forms of the Renaissance or of any other past culture. Each age finds its own technique. The modern artist, it seems to me, is working and expressing an inner world. In other words, expressing the energy and the motion and other inner forces." And so what he's arguing is that he can't use this to express the age of the atomic bomb, the age of mass media, right? That we need a new form, right? That we're living in a chaotic age. And all art reflects the age in which it was created. And so he's suggesting this is our age. We are different. And so what he's really trying to do here is he suggests that in the 20th century and 21st century, right, 20th and beyond, is that we've become too Apollonian. We've used our science and technology to the point where we now have the ability to kill all life on Earth in 15 minutes. Right? That's a tremendous amount of power. And he suggests that we become so separate, so individualistic, that we've lost the ability to have empathy for one another. And so this is creating a sense that we might be just dumb enough to use this kind of weapons that would destroy all life on earth. So he suggests that we are living in a chaotic age. And so he's reflecting that. But in a way, right, he's also suggesting we need to find emotion, right? We need to be able to discover who we truly are, to be able to feel again, to avoid our destruction, right? He feels as though in the modern age, and we kind of feel this even today in 2020, we certainly feel that we're kind of on the edge of a precipice. We're on the edge of a cliff. We're kind of, wondering as though we feel as though, whether it's environment or whether it's COVID or whatever the case may be, that all life on earth, it feels as though it's a little bit tenuous. It feels as though it's kind of a fragile thing. But we've become so emotionless that we stopped caring for others. And so he's trying to kind of invest emotion within each person. So he's trying to display what we need. What we need today is emotion, right? So you might not necessarily like it at first, but that's at least what he's seeking to do. Taking a look at Nietzsche's warning, right? He suggests that Apollonian impulses always seek to destroy Dionysian, right? Because we don't like disorder, we don't like the unknown, right? We have this desire to understand the mysteries of the universe, and we have this desire to control nature, right? As we feel that nature is acting against us in 2020 with COVID, we now are investing a large amount of resources in order to control it, right? To find the vaccine, to be able to get this thing under control so we can get back to normal, right? However, right, Dionysian impulses always seek to destroy Apollonian impulses, right? They seek to humble our efforts to understand and control the universe and nature, right? That nature sometimes does act back, right? There's this backlash against that helps us to realize that we're not really in control, that there are bigger forces out there than what human beings have, right? Couple examples, right? Elements that are beyond control and our understanding. Mount Vesuvius erupted in 79 AD, destroying a civilization, right? The bubonic plague comes in 1349, hits Italy, and then ravishes Europe for the next 150 years, right? The Malaysian flight in 2014, the news spent months, right? That was all we heard about, was trying to find where that flight went and what happened to it, because we wanted to understand how could we live in this modern age of the 21st century and lose an entire flight with hundreds of people in it, right? We have to understand. But occasionally, right, nature acts back, right? Hurricane Matthew in 2016, Hurricane Harvey 2017, Hurricane Irma, Hurricane Florence, right? We have all of these natural elements that are completely acting against us, or the California fires this year, or the Australian fires this year. Nature acting against us that we can't necessarily control, but we're seeking to, right? So there's this constant, yin and yang between them, all right? And so again, just to kind of think about these ideas a little bit more with our attacks against reason, right? So we have a couple other moments, right? That it's not just nature attacking us, but it also can be pockets of groups, right? We have September 11th, where Al-Qaeda flies 2 planes into the Twin Towers, and then crashes one into the Pentagon, right? We have the Boston Marathon, just kind of moments, pockets of chaos that seem to emerge in our society, or the Paris attacks in 2015, the Bastille Day attacks in 2016, Las Vegas attacks in 2017. Now we have a lot of riots happening throughout the United States. And so constantly we have some chaos that seeks to uproot the existing order. And it's not to say that these, pockets are always inherently bad. Sometimes they're necessary to humble the efforts of the Apollonian. But these cases, right, that I'm presenting before you are the ones that are inherently bad, right? They're inherently destructive in that sense. Here's a question that I want you to think about, just in closing, right? Researchers who analyze Nietzsche's ideas assert that social stability occurs with a proper balance of Apollonian and Dionysian ideals. Thinking about the Book of Mormon, how do you see these tensions when there is a proper imbalance, right? Or an improper balance, rather. So as we see this, right, in the Book of Mormon, how do we see this conflict between this civilization versus barbarism, right? Are Apollonian forces always positive, and are Dionysian forces always inherently negative, right? Can Apollonian forces be negative and Dionysian forces be positive? Which force do you think prevails at the end of the Book of Mormon, right? And why is that the case? And then here's another question to think about. Thinking about our world, do you think that we have found a proper balance between Apollo and Dionysus? Or do you think that we have too much emphasis on one or the other, right? If so, which one, right? Which one do you think that we're more thinking about the United States, for instance? Do you think the United States is more Apollonian, or do you think it's more Dionysian, right? And so think about a couple of specifics that you could point to that would demonstrate your answer, right? Your response to that as evidence. And then I want you to think about our cultural manifestations, the art, literature, film of today, right? Of our age. Do you think that we embrace one impulse more than another, or have we found this proper balance between them, right? Are the themes more Apollonian or Dionysian? So some things to think about, right, as our cultural manifestations that are around us today. What do you think our art emphasizes, and why, right? Why do you think it emphasizes this, right? Just a couple examples to consider. What does our art say about us? What is our art seeking to do, right? If our art is more Apollonian, is it because we're Dionysian and the artists are trying to correct us? Or on the other hand, is our art more Dionysian because the artists feel that we're more Apollonian, right? Or what's going on within that? So just some thoughts to think about as we think about, the ideas of what is art, how does art reflect its society, what message is it saying as we start to apply the principles of the art analysis, the lines, shading, color, texture, composition. As we start to apply those to try to derive meaning, what is the artist saying, right? So these are some thoughts to think about as we move forward.